So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening for what promises to be a really interesting event. I should actually also point out, if you hadn't realized, that it's International Women's Day today. So I'm about to do something that's quite interactive. When I say Happy International Women's Day, you say it back to me. Okay, ready? Happy International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day. I love it. Thank you very much. Thank you. So today's conversation really marks the start of a beginning of a series of conversations that we're going to be having on really important aspects of lived and living experiences around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And joining me today on the panel are two senior female leaders of the University of Westminster, and they are Dr. Randhir Auluk and Professor Alexander Hughes. And I'm going to refer to you as Randhir and Alex going forward. Okay. So the conversations that we're going to have are really about the important step change that the university needs to take to embed some key things in the fabric of the institution. One of them is equity. So this is a direction that we need to move to. And in doing so, we need to recognize and appreciate and sometimes challenge some of the issues around intersecting characteristics of identity that make up the Westminster community of colleagues, students, and alumni. So I'm going to start by introducing the speakers, and then I shall introduce myself, and then I'll briefly say what the format for this evening will be. So first of all, I'll turn to Alex. So Professor Alex Hughes is a highly experienced university leader who's worked in institutions across the spectrum of UK higher education, building and delivering strategic priorities. As Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Global Engagement and Employability at the University of Westminster, Alex leads the university's internationalization activities, working with colleagues across the institution. Our global engagement agenda is key to our vision, embracing areas from overseas student recruitment and partnerships to the internationalization of the student and staff experience and relations with overseas alumni. And we're really pleased to have students here with us this evening, so welcome to you all as well. She also leads our employability strategy, placing it at the heart of student experience priorities, and she's a co-chair of the university's EDI committee. So I think you already understand what that abbreviation stands for, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. So previously, Alex was Pro-Vice-Chancellor External at the University of Kent, where she led the university's internationalization strategy. So internationalization is very much at the core of Alex's work. Her remit also included the non-academic student experience and the employability agenda. So student experience was a focus of Alex's work at Birmingham University, where she was Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Quality and Students. And now to Dr. Randhir Auluk. So Randhir is head of school for Organisation, Economy and Society here at the University of Westminster. And this is part of our business school. Previously, she was Associate Head of School for Enterprise and Innovation in the School of Leadership and Strategy at Coventry University. She led the school's executive development and CPD programs valued at over £11 million and partnerships. Also, she's a City Councillor for Coventry City Council and is Vice Chair of the Planning Committee. So Randhir has experience in local government, public service reform, leadership development, human resource management, and diversity management. So she's well placed in the business school. And she's led various leadership development projects in the public and corporate sectors. Before this, Randhir held several roles in the Centre for Management and Policy Studies, part of the Cabinet Office, including Head of International Projects in Africa and in the National School of Government. She's led a large number of institutional strengthening and capacity building programs internationally. She's been on secondment to the South African Public Service in Pretoria and the French Ministry of Industry, Finance and Economics in Paris. She's acted as advisor to various international governments, including India, Bangladesh, Namibia, Malawi, Uganda, and South Africa, and led a capacity building project with the government of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Management Institute, and the Civil Service College. So really kind of global experience coming from Randhir. That'll do. I've got another 2 paragraphs, but we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there. Perfect. So I'll now just briefly introduce myself. So I'm a senior lecturer in psychology. I'm also a chartered psychologist, and I'm the co-chair for the university's BME, so we'll use the acronym there, Black Minority and Ethnic Colleague Network here at the university, which I co-chair with Professor Divyesh Anand. I'm also the lead for the Black History Year program here at the university. I'm the outreach lead for psychology and a member of the Psychologist and Digest editorial committee. I'm also a former member, and this is a long title, of the British Psychological Society's Presidential Task Force for Diversity and Inclusion. And I sit on several university committees with an EDI focus. So my research interests are specifically in race, ethnicity, and racialized experiences, and how underrepresented people develop a sense of belonging and construct their identity. So it's my privilege this evening to be in conversation with Alex and with Randhir. And today's conversation is going to center on 3 things. So first of all, we're going to look at how identities are forged through cultural connection, through difference, and border crossings, and how they contribute to, secondly, developing a professional identity, building and sustaining professional and personal development, and thirdly, how experiences such as these engender resilience. And that's a term that you probably hear used quite often. You know, people are always wanting to know, how can I be more resilient? So hopefully we'll get some important insights from our speakers on those points this afternoon. There will be time for questions and comments from the audience after this conversation, and that will be followed by some networking and socializing. And it's really good to be able to say that, doing that in a physical space, when I think previously people would raise a glass on MS Teams, and that was the end of it. So now we'll physically be able to network. So first of all, we're going to begin with a brief presentation from each speaker on their personal experiences of cultural border crossings and the impact that these have had on their identity and or identities, because we are multiple things. So I shall begin with Alex.
Thank you very much, Debs. Yes, it's interesting to be in this environment and to be talking about some things which are about professional... Oh, sorry. I do apologise. So it's really interesting and a privilege to be in this environment where we are talking about professional matters, but also deeply personal matters. And I think for me, it took quite a long time to understand how intimately bound up those 2 things were with each other. We're going to be talking about our lived experiences, our personal stories, and my personal story was one which involved some discoveries about the backstory of that when I was middle-aged. I think if anyone had asked me for a long time what I thought had forged my identity, I would have said a white, upper-working, lower-middle-class family. My brother and I were the first people in our families to go to university. It was an aspirational family which placed a great value on education. But I would have said a white context, and a white context which produced some people who enjoyed very much white privilege through education. When I was in my middle years, and I was aware of the fact that my parents had met in British India, in that colonial context of the British occupation in India, it became apparent that there was another family story which I was entirely unfamiliar with, which involved racial mixity on my mother's side, a long presence in India of an Anglo-Indian line, a complicated story with an Anglo-Indian mother and a white father, which produced a very different understanding in me, which I spent many, many years thinking through, of what my family context and my family background represented. And we'll come back to these matters later, but I think when I think about the production of my identity and the familial and social and cultural factors that forged it, I've come to understand that those factors had layers that I was unaware of for many, many years, and yet significantly inflected how I understand my identity and how I've operated in the world as a subject, as a gendered subject, and eventually as somebody with a leadership role. So I think that one of the things that I think will come out of this discussion is that sense of how stories are mutable, the stories that form us, the discourses that form us, to use a slightly Foucauldian way of looking at this, are not single or simple. They evolve, and layers can be added to them. And as we reflect on those layers, our identities change. So I think that's all I want to say in terms of introduction, and we will certainly be coming back to these matters. So I'm going to hand over to Randa.
Okay, that was really helpful. And to begin with, did you notice I did a big twitch as the wonderful Deborah was doing that introduction of self? And I think that signals something about the messaging around how you present self. So I felt supremely warm and uncomfortable, thinking, is that really me? However, it was almost like a formula one follows in terms of when you're writing that kind of biographical statement, okay? But to share with you, because I think part of this process is about connecting with your internal self as well as what you project to the world. And just picking up on why was I uncomfortable? I mean, I've got a whole set of written points, I'm going to park those. So why was I uncomfortable? I think that signals something really interesting. So I come from a Punjabi Jat Sikh background. And really, if I followed that path that was defined for me, I shouldn't really be here. I should still be in that village back home in the Punjab, married at 16, with, children, farming, perhaps, growing sweet corn at this time of year. However, there is that then however. So there was that sense of that was the path that was originally laid. And then somehow I deviated from the path. And the kinds of things that I wanted just to pick up on is when I was growing up, there were core messages. Now these came from my mother, my aunt, the community around what a good girl should be like, what a good woman should be like, which is quite interesting. And I'm interested still to think about how much of that do I bring to myself now in my professional world, because I think there are interesting connections. So just want to make a couple of quick points. The first one was this notion of Gesmet. Have you all heard of Gesmet? Kismet? Okay, Gesmet. The path that is predefined for you. They do your astrological charts at the point of birth, and that is, you're done and dusted. So the idea, mother, father, I'm going to choose my career. Well, dear daughter, it's set for you that you're going to marry the local farmer and grow corn. So that was quite interesting. And so that notion of how do you resist the preordained? And it wasn't without struggle. And that struggle was quite helpful because it's left me with a sense of if there are things that you strongly believe in, you have to stand up and ask for those or fight for those. So that's quite interesting. And yet, many others in my family group went with the path that was preordained. So what was it that I decided I wasn't going to do that? The next was this concept of izzat. Do you know izzat? Honor? Yes? So again, messages, what a Punjabi Jat Sikh woman should be like. Izzat. You do not do anything that damages family or community honor for fear of your life and big punishment. And again, reconciling that with defining what honor meant to me. So rather than in the traditional sense of obedience and doing what the men in the world want you to do, I have taken that idea of is it an honour to say, what does it mean to be honourable and working in ways that are honourable? The next one tied to is it is this notion of sharam, shame. Is that a concept that rings bells for some of you? And again, that was deeply ingrained in terms of the choices one makes and the behaviour that you have. And again, I've taken that on board, but not in the traditional sense. So in terms of shame, how have I taken that now and interpreted that in my professional life, is around only doing things that don't keep me up at night. So if I feel I've done something and it makes me anxious, that if I feel I haven't done something that's proper and decent. So can I sleep at night? And I would say most of the time I can and do. And then finally, and then I'll leave it for the conversation, is the concept of seva, S-E-V-A, the idea of serving community. Again, this was a very, very powerful message as I was growing up, the idea that it's not about you as an individual, it's about you as a member of a group, of a community, and the choices that you make and the actions that you take must be compelled by the greater good. And for me, I feel in my mind at least, that I carry that with me to my world of work, to my leadership role, and I think in my own head, at least, it informs and influences every decision I make. And then just to tie that up with, when I started, I was told, we at Westminster believe in the idea of bringing your entire self to work. Yes, your whole self. And this is why I think it is important to be able to make those connections between yourself in a holistic sense and yourself in terms of your professional identity and your professional self at work. Now you might say, does it really matter? What would happen if I didn't? And I would say to you just one thing on that, and then I will leave it there, is for me, it is that idea, if you don't connect those bits of self, personal identity and professional identity, it sometimes can leave a sense of unease. Okay, discontent or some kind of fracturing that will seep out. Don't want to sound like Cassandra and doom and gloom, but it can seep out or leak out. And that sense of feeling conflicted, okay, so that's why it matters. And what it leads to is a sense of being at ease, which leads to hardiness, which leads to resilience, which is where we started. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've touched on some really important aspects of identity, both of you. And I suppose how this is positioned for me, it's as if we have a safe and there's a combination, and we're now about to kind of turn the different aspects of this lock to crack the safe open. Thinking about your identity, let's position this from the perspective of Stuart Hall. Some of you might be familiar with him. One of the great sociocultural thinkers of our time. And he said that identity is transforming and ongoing, and that it seems to be more about your roots, as in R-O-U-T-E-S, so your destination, than it is about your roots, R-O-O-T-S, so your origins. So using that as a kind of backdrop, and we're not going to sort of spend a lot of time dissecting, you know, what Stuart Hall meant by this. I want to ask you to reflect on your roots, and particularly as you'd started, Alex, thinking about the mixity of your roots, and how your roots have impacted on your R-O-U-T-S, so your current destination.
These are interesting questions. One of the problems that I have with that notion of roots is that roots are rarely monolithic, and I think I would answer that question differently, depending on whether I'm reflecting on my gendered roots or my cultural or cross-cultural roots. I think that it is certainly the case for many women's subjects, and in fact I spent quite a lot of time looking at this as an academic and a researcher, that a key aspect of personal development and identity development for mothers, for women, is a process of separation from their mothers. And I think that most of us as female subjects have a sense of that process of differentiation and separation as key to our development, to the personal and professional routes we've pursued. I think that the answer would be a different answer in terms of cultural roots. I think that cultural roots are enduringly formative and intense and a matter of ongoing relation, probably in a different way from gendered roots. I'm speaking quite personally here because I know that the gendered aspect of my identity has involved that very clear sense of a need for separation, and the cultural side of it, this belatedly discovered cultural side, has actually been much more about a will to connection and reconnection and investigation. But none of that is simple. These things all overlap. And I think that, for me, the way in which my professional roots have connected to my personal roots has become ever more strongly an object of reflection in recent years. And that's actually been a very positive thing. I think that both in my professional life and my personal life, an engagement with how, on an almost daily basis, I am engaging with my background is a really positive aspect of reflection, not a disabling thing at all, and not a matter of some rather simplistic identity politics, but the focus of some incredibly fruitful reflection, which I think has actually made my engagements with other people perhaps kinder, certainly stronger, certainly more reflective. So I think that while I wouldn't see roots as in any way monolithic, I do think that reflection on roots is an incredibly important, roots with two O's, is an incredibly important component part in how we think all the time about our personal and political and cultural development. This is certainly a process that is very ongoing for me. It's a process which had some quite focused conversations in my middle years, which were enabled by somebody else, and that was actually a very helpful part of that process of reflection. I think sometimes it's rather difficult to think through some of these things single-handedly, and I think making those part of a conversation in whatever context is a really deeply valuable thing to do. And I hope that in today's discussion in the audience, we might have a bit of an opportunity to do some of that.
Okay, thank you. Really, really interesting. Lots of points that connect. And it's a shame this isn't more conversational so we could all contribute. So just keeping this very, very brief. I think roots, as in destination, are fluid, and for me were fluid. So despite having astrological charts that mapped every year of my life, I just went with the flow, and that's an interesting value now. Strong believer, go with the flow, light on structure, which is quite interesting. The point that you made, Alex, around separation. So for me, a big thing was separation from family and traditional family, because they brought a lot of support. And the idea to break with family, and that's what it took, to say, I'm going to make my own choices, which meant a form of ostracism, if you like, from family and community, and a sort of shunning. And I still, have a son, and sometimes we'd go into situations and people you could see them almost physically turn their back. Not quite, not to be overtly rude, because I married outside the culture. So there was all those interplays. So cliche, hold your head up high. Told my son we hold up our head up high. We're ashamed. We're not ashamed of the choices we make and who we are, and striding into situations on our terms. And I think that's part of my, if you like, being now, where I can, doing things on my terms. But that break is often really painful, so I don't think we should underestimate the price that people have to pay to make a choice that's different from the one that's preordained. And that transformative piece, again, very powerful. Not easy. It's easier said than done. You know, people say, well, why don't you just get up and do what you want? There is a price to pay. And I think in many ways, you know, some of it still is being paid. But then the opportunity that comes, the freedom that comes from recognizing that you do have choice. Maybe some of you in the room feel that you don't, your choice is limited. But there is a real power and freedom when you get to that point. So through that journey, just it's interesting, that concept I spoke about, seva, it dominated so many choices that I made. So when I first left university, I thought, seva, I have to serve. So I headed to Swansea Docks. So whilst my roommate went and became an accountant and earned a fortune, retired at 30, I'm like, I'm going to save the world. Headed to Swansea Docks and worked with single homeless men. The only time that I've been physically assaulted, a couple of times. But even that adjustment and the idea of how do you survive, and the survival came by being with other people who were there in that endeavour with you. Then going into public service and being a social worker, working in child protection, trying, again, maybe I have a saviour complex, who knows, but the idea that I'm going to try and save somebody somewhere. It then just went from there, and the key in all of this was having people who helped me understand the possibilities and the pathways that were open. And that, for me, has been a key thing. So recreating a sense of family, recreating a sense of community through friendship and other kinds of support beyond the traditional kind.
Thank you. It's interesting, some of those concepts that you articulate so clearly, so the concept of Izat and Seva, are mirrored in all of our cultures. We may have different words for them, different terms, different ways of experiencing them, but I think they form the bedrock of culture, and then can often guide, you know, how we do what we do. I'd also like to open this up to conversation more generally. So if at any point you'd like to ask a question rather than saving them all to the end, then please feel free to just raise your hand. We do have a mic, and you can engage in conversation directly with the speakers on any of the points that are being raised. So at this point, then, I'm going to move on to the topic of resilience.
Okay.
It's one that's important for us all in all sorts of ways. And, you know, you talked about some of the guiding principles of your life and the importance of going with the flow, which I consider to be an important aspect of resilience, because, you know, when the wind blows, if you're really rigid, you may break. So there has to be a bit of bend and melding and so on. As a black feminist myself, and a strong advocate for what is considered, I think, in politics and parliament as a bit of a dirty word, but critical race theory, which is really strongly advocating the importance of storytelling, black feminists argue that identity, within the storytelling kind of domain, is a state that is developed and appraised in response to a number of factors. So some of those are institutional, some are political, some are societal. It could be conflict, it could be conformity. So a myriad of set of demands. So with that kind of backdrop in mind, what personal forms of resilience, and you did mention some of those as guiding principles, Randia, but what personal forms of resilience have you had to practice, or do you currently practice, to manage your identity? Now here it comes, specifically, as a senior female leader. And it might be the same kinds of practices that you hold to in the home or on the street or in any other aspects of your life, but just sort of staying for a moment within higher education, what forms of resilience do you practice or have you practiced that have enabled you to manage the identity of a senior female leader? I'm going to start with you, Randia.
So I couldn't just say, I agree with Alex. I'm going to agree with Alex, whatever she says in a minute anyway. That's a very big question. Resilience, very important. So I've already said it. It's holding things lightly, okay? So not gripping too hard, and always looking to see if, one way is blocked, is there another way? So rather than, and maybe that's it, I'm reacting against that idea of predestiny, saying, okay, if there's a big boulder in the way, is there a way around it? Can we dig our way underneath it? Can we climb over it? And so for me, that's an important part of the resilience bit, not seeing obstacles as obstacles, seeing them as something else. And that idea that we can find a way through it together, no matter what. That's another bit. And then something about seeing and hearing things for what they are. And sometimes at work, as elsewhere, we have to face difficult things, difficult choices. And some of that, I think, is about facing those, making those choices with as much integrity as possible. But that goes back to my point, still being able to sleep at night. And that's not to say there's never going to come a moment when it does feel all too much, and that's when the key is having people around to help you think things through, help you make connections, help you get over that big dip that might occur. And what's really helped me, I think, is I'm a social anthropologist by background, so I quite like seeing how can you break into certain groups, and I've tried, and it's quite interesting, particularly when they bolt the door and they put a padlock on it and put a big sign, "We don't want you in here." I'm like, oh, okay, how can I break through? And that is really interesting, and having done it now, I'm on a roll. So that's the bit about resilience. So experience, opportunity, grabbing the opportunity, I think that builds these layers, a bit like the onion effect. And knowing that you can do it if you keep going. So that idea of persistence, so that's all part of resilience. And holding oneself very lightly. Just as a tiny thing, when I worked in South Africa, a friend of mine used to say, "Oh, you've got a hole in your tights or a ladder in your tights." And I'd say, "Yeah, and I like it." It's like, "Oh, really? Is that not a bit unprofessional?" And say, "No, but I like it because it reminds me to be very down to earth." It's like a little flaw deliberately. So I've got loads of tights with lots of ladders that I wear with pride. But that idea, just keeping connected and grounded, and I think that's all part of resilience too.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was interested to hear your use of the word rigidity as opposed to going with the flow, because I've had a number of leadership roles in my career, starting with a head of school role in Birmingham. And I think when I first stepped into leadership roles, I saw resilience as being allied to rigidity, to an enclosed sort of identity which I felt had to be quite hard-shelled to be efficient and competent and highly organised. And that, despite being quite a conversational and chatty person in my personal life, I know that I had a somewhat masculinised, to use a rather boring cliche, notion of what a leader looked like. And I found myself thinking quite often about what in Lacanian terms is called a gestalt, something which is very unitary and unified and kind of closed and strong. And I think that without consciously recognising I was doing so, I saw that model of leadership as something which enabled me to be effective and resilient. I very much hope that as the years have rolled by and I've softened up and gone with the flow more and reflected more, that has been replaced by something more engaged, more discursive, more reflective, more likely to listen rather than to charge ahead. I think when one is thinking about leadership, one's got to be highly sceptical about some of the models of leadership we hear about. There are all sorts of instruments that tell you what kind of a leader you are. I did a thing called Myers-Briggs many times, and it always produced me as somebody who's an ENTJ, who's very much a driver of action, a leader from the front, somebody who forces things along energetically. For me, that isn't necessarily the most resilient of models, particularly if you cleave to it in an unreflected way. I think being more open, more dialogic, more prepared to listen, more prepared to engage with other people and recognise problems as opportunities and obstacles as opportunities to learn. And I think that one of the things that's been a great privilege at Westminster and that has helped me on that journey is the EDI work, actually, because I think certainly since I've been working with colleagues around EDI, my capacity to be more flexible, to be more reflective, to be more open has developed considerably. So I think one of the things I would say is not only for me is that a form of resilience now, but it can be learned and engaged with at any point in one's career, including mine. And I'm not in the first flush of youth anymore, but I think that I have learned things in recent years at Westminster that have enhanced my resilience and made me, I hope, a more effective leader.
Thank you. And I know we have other leaders as well in the audience that I'm sure some of those experiences will resonate in various ways. Just touching on the Gestalt for a minute, we know that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. What happens when the parts come under attack? So I'm going to position this in this way. Professor Nicola Rollock did some really important research in 2019 where she looked at the experiences of black female professors. And she found that their constructions of strength and resilience were being kind of recreated as in a negative fashion, interpreted as dominance, aggression, sort of this kind of hostile takeover, all those things, rigidity, all of those kinds of constructs. And particularly, this came from their white counterparts, male counterparts. So have you experienced this kind of counter-narrative? And how have you been able to respond? Alex?
Yes, I certainly have encountered it on many an occasion. It's very difficult to know how to respond. You can simply let it be, go with the flow, not challenge. I don't think that's the right thing to do, but challenge has to be measured and managed. Deflecting that kind of counter-narrative with humour is something that has worked for me quite well in a number of contexts, not always. Sometimes you do have to challenge and contest. I think that that's easier the further one is along one's leadership journey. I can certainly recall instances of that kind of behaviour when I was very new in leadership roles, where I was very much at a loss as to know what to do. That changes, I think, as you get older and more experienced. And it never goes away, this, and there are all sorts of forms that counter-narrative can take. When they're very explicit, it's much easier to challenge them than when they proceed through banter, for example. Banter is always a very interesting channel for the kind of problematic narrative that Debs has just referred to. So I think one has to be quite careful and listen and judge what the best response is, and perhaps try and be a little bit detached from some of that counter-narrative and reflect on it rather than leaping in. I don't follow my own advice entirely, but I do think detachment and reflection is probably a way of engaging with it. It's not a phenomenon that's disappearing. And it relates to women, it relates to LGBTQ+ colleagues, it relates to BME colleagues, it relates to anyone who departs from what is an enduring mainstream model of leadership.
Thank you. So much to say, so little time. So to be selective, it's interesting, the labels that get stuck. And I think for Asian women, Indian women, they may be slightly different, as in subservient, quiet. And what happens to you if you go to play to counter type? That is always interesting. I think it comes as a shock. Oh my God, she's assertive. Oh my God, she's got a voice. Oh my God, she's saying something that's contrary to being nice. However, yes, so all the things that you said, I've seen and see, and I agree with Alex, it's about reading the moment, and I always think there's more than one way to get the outcome that you want, and making that judgment call. I have always found it easier to challenge when it's other people. So if somebody's doing that about other people, I've been really clear, no matter what, and as you say, to say it in a very matter-of-fact way, and to make it clear that it's not acceptable to me. I have had that kind of conversation, dear friends, where then there are probably about 7 people in the room. They've brought me in the room, they've closed the door. So I've been pinned against the wall, but I still say my piece. I say, this is how it is. And that happened a few times where they're like, oh, but you're the only one that says this thing. And I'm saying, well, I am saying it. It doesn't matter. Just because it's me who sees it, and I'm telling you, I'm not at ease with what has been said or done, and how people are being labelled unfairly or treated unfairly. So it's harder when it's happening to you. And the thing I have learnt, particularly from the world of politics, is go wide. So I go as far as I can. Not that way, but out that way. And then the momentum comes, and then things happen. So it's something about timing, seeing, thinking about alternatives, and just, again, another thing I've learned is knowing what lines I will not cross. So knowing where the line is, and I think that's where the Punjabi Jatsi thing comes, because they say, if there's something you really believe in, you have to be prepared to sacrifice yourself. And I've done that a little sometimes, and I'm saying, okay, I don't care what price I have to pay because I believe in this thing. And thankfully, things have worked out. But again, it's interesting in terms of identity. It still lurks, it still seeps. And some people might say, well, that wasn't the wisest, I'm saying, but it's fine. It's what I feel I need to do. And maybe that's the bit that's helped me break into these closed doors, that sort of set. But I agree, still there, still needs to be challenged.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience.
Yes. Do you want to?
I was just scratching my head, actually. Huh? I was scratching my head. I have to now.
You do have to, go on.
Okay.
You go first. I'll go.
Oh God, I was scratching my head again. Hi, my name is Lonseni Kuruma. I've just started my PhD since September. I think 4 of us, one of us is not here today. We are part of the BME, the 3 or 4 students that were awarded the PhD due to, I don't know if I should say due to what happened in 2020. Basically things I've heard is that when it comes to resilience, I've seen myself of where you said you have to go far, not far this way, far that way. I think I've seen myself in those situations. What happened then, there's this sense of feeling alone. You will get the result you want, because you went far, because they have to be honest. Then, once you get far, then that's the action. Then after, if you have to stay in that space, then it's really isolating. It's really, really depressing. I've seen myself in a situation where I had to take a month out because I was so anxious, so down with it. So it is you will get things done, but what about your own mental health in that situation? Most of the time there's no help. You didn't have to take a time out and look after your own sanity. That was my example of it. Yeah, to add on to what you said. Yeah.
Very swiftly, I'm with you. I felt it, that little moment that you were describing. And so having good friends around you so you can offload, I think it's really important. I have done a lot of writing, so I have notebooks everywhere, wherever you trip over a notebook, and I scribble and I scribble and I scribble, and I write dialogue. Maybe I should be a playwright. I write dialogue. They said, I said, they said, I said, or they said, I felt, to somehow externalize it, to help me make sense of it all. And I find that's been quite an interesting process. And then I'm very cheeky. I then write poetry, and then I put it in places where certain people can see it. So, apologies. But it's that sense of feeling I've got to take back some power somewhere, not to be so downtrodden and feeling so dismal and so I look for tiny, tiny slivers where I can somehow reclaim some of that. But I agree, it can be a really difficult place, and so it is something about recognizing when you're there, when you're feeling like that, and not letting yourself be overwhelmed by it and saying, okay, so this is how I am, who can I turn to? Who will understand without me having to explain it from A to Z. I feel down because I've had this encounter that I felt was racist or sexist or humiliating. Who understands intuitively how it is? I think there's a lot of value in that. But thank you so much for speaking and asking the first question.
Thank you.
I think what you've raised there is one of the paradoxes of academic life, because contestation and critique are critical to academic life. That is what we are about. We're not about being silent or agreeing things. We are about challenging, contesting, critiquing, exploring, taking the discourse forward. And yet when you do that in certain contexts in universities, you can end up feeling not at home, out of place, isolated. And I think when I felt like that, because we all feel like that, I have reminded myself that it is part of my role as a member of an academic community to precisely challenge and contest. And to do that because that's what we're about. And it's kind of helpful. It doesn't make that feeling of isolation go away, but it's at least a reminder that this is actually what we're about. So that is one tiny little solution that I've found to that phenomenon that you've raised, which I think lots of us encounter all the time.
Tiny little thing. Just very swiftly, an example came to mind in terms of the leadership role. So sometimes I have had members of the staff who have really feared something happening from somebody further up the food chain. So on occasions I've said, well, tell them I said it. Tell them I did it. Because I know they're not going to hammer me as hard as they're going to hammer somebody else. And so those are the ways where then, in a leadership role, I feel an obligation to step in and say, I can take the heat because somehow I'm in a better place, stronger mental state or something, so that person doesn't become totally crushed if they've told me they're lacking confidence and they're fearing the smack that's about to come, the metaphorical smack. And sometimes that's what I've done as well.
And I think that, when I was a young researcher, I read an awful lot of stuff because my research was very gender-related on finding a voice. But I think I've come to realise that we're part of a composite voice, and joining our voices with others is a protective thing to do, and it's part of being part of an academic community. So Randa has just illustrated one way of doing that, but not being a lone voice, where there are ways of not being a lone voice, is incredibly helpful in terms of that process of challenge and contestation. And that's why I think some of the developments we've seen at Westminster, the colleague networks, for example, are so critical, because there are communities of voice there that make some of those processes of challenge, inquiry, contestation easier, not easy, but easier.
Thank you. And we're also really pleased to have the one of the co-chairs of the Women of Westminster Network joining us this evening. Thank you, Sylvia. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did just briefly. We were talking just before this about the counter-narratives that negatively frame the ways in which people are tackling their leadership roles. So I wondered whether either of you had another kind of counter-narrative, which is the narrative which is phrased through compliments of particular characteristics, essentially as a way of keeping you in a particular place that the speaker would like you to be in.
Occasionally, but probably because of the degree of challenging I'm somewhat prone to do, that's happened less frequently than the counter-narrative that Deb's referred to, which is the Bolshe woman counter-narrative, actually. But it's certainly a recognised thing, Sal, I think, that it's almost a kind of killing with kindness or silencing with kindness sort of strategy, and I think one encounters that in all sorts of contexts.
Yeah, I think silencing, really.
Absolutely agree. And I was just looking for some examples. So along my career journey, I've gone for things where they said, sorry, you're too academic. Who can be too academic? Okay, apparently I was. Elsewhere, sorry, you're not academic enough. Okay. You're really an ideas person, and we don't know that necessarily they'd be a good fit for management. So these messages abound, and I think it's really about what we internalize and what we accept and take on. It's interesting, in one of the other roles, often when we have a debate, sometimes it's happened, I come out the room and a couple of my male colleagues say, you don't need to speak that much. You don't really need to. And I'm like, but if I feel this is important, who's timing it? And it's just another way of saying, look, just know your place and be good, metaphorical patting on the head. So I say, thank you very much. And I still speak next time as I want to speak. So some of it is about just hearing and either saying, okay, I don't accept that, but you don't always have to get into a kind of confrontation to expose it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. It sort of reminds me of a death by 1,000 compliments, constant sort of edging away at who you are. And then you have to find a way of getting to the credibility of some of those comments, because some of them might actually be genuine. But what's the intent behind that? Where's it all going? And it kind of leads me on to just thinking about how everything that we've just discussed feeds into a concept that you raised, talking about the experience of feeling isolated and so on. The importance of sense of belonging, and of course the experience of unbelonging. Those two things sit side by side often. And I suppose, just reflecting very briefly on my own experience, for a very long time in higher education, I felt a sense of unbelonging. And I had to work at this on a regular basis, and it became my responsibility, which it shouldn't have. It took a while, long story short. It took meeting, actually, people like our Vice-Chancellor, Peter, who really, Peter, who played a prominent role in saying to me that you actually can take up an authentic space in this university, and hearing those voices from other people, that kind of then became the counter-narrative that I needed to those experiences of death by 1,000 compliments. So I want to kind of stay a little bit with the notion of a sense of belonging. Now, you've been in higher education for a while. And I suppose if I were to ask you, do you feel that you belong here? And if you were to say that openly with the Vice-Chancellor present, it could be risky. But I want to ask you, do you feel that you belong here? And what about the people you lead? Do you feel that they have a sense of belonging?
I think I would answer that question differently, depending on which bits of my lengthy career in HE I'm talking about. I think that as an academic, a teacher and a researcher, I had a very clear and strong sense of belonging, both in the institutions where I taught and researched and as part of a wider intellectual community, in this case, French studies, 20th century French studies. That was very clear to me. I think that as a leader, that sense of belonging is more challenged and more open to a constant process of renegotiation than I experienced when I was an academic. I would say I do feel a sense of belonging at Westminster, but it's more challenging to have that sense of belonging when you're in a leadership community, not least when you're a leader, rather, because when you are a leader in an institution, you are by definition somewhat detached from many, many of your colleagues and your teams. You're often in a rather isolated position, particularly if you move institutions and you no longer have that academic community of which you were part when you were a teacher and researcher. So I think that it's more complicated and more open to negotiation and reflection than was previously the case when I was having my academic career. I also would say one of the things that has made me feel I do belong at Westminster and have a community or a new community and a multiplicity of voices is precisely the EDI work. And that's been something that's been part of my life at this university over the last 2 years. It wasn't previously. That actually has enhanced my sense of belonging because it's brought me into contact with a new community of peers. And I think having a community of peers is so critical to a sense of institutional belonging. I think you often don't have that as a leader. So I am very grateful, actually, that I've kind of found a way of rediscovering it. I do know also that the people I work with, particularly in the EDI context, often reflect on belonging and unbelonging, as Deborah just has done. So I think that this is an ongoing object of discussion for at least that group of people I work with, and rightly so, because it enables us to reflect on institutional development and change, and that's incredibly important.
That's a challenging question to ask a social anthropologist, I have to say. So I think belonging is an interesting idea, concept, feeling, process, two-way dynamic. Your question about do I, and I'm a newbie. This is like week 8 for me. So yeah, I feel the mere fact that we're here today, 8 weeks in, the wonderful Deborah and the wonderful Alex and the wonderful Debesh invited me to join the party, I would say, has helped me be on that pathway to a sense of belonging. And I was thinking, well, what does belonging actually mean? And it's a two-way thing. It's how do I feel about you and how do you feel about me? It's that kind of multi-connect point. So is it things like, do I feel safe? Do I feel valued? Do I feel involved? Do I feel wanted? Do I feel included? Do I feel seen? Do I feel heard? All of those kinds of things. Do you see me for me, the wonderful me I am? Or excuse me. Or am I in a little cookie cutter shape that you say, oh yeah, that's where we put her? Some of the points that were made earlier. And and then from mine is, do I really understand what makes this community tick? Do I really understand what's important beyond the rhetoric? Because sometimes, you know, that sense of you think you know, and then until it's tested, and you think, oh my goodness, really? Do they really think it's okay to do that? So I feel like it's a new thing. It's a lovely relationship so far. I hope the honeymoon never ends. It's feeling good so far. Yeah. So really interesting, but it can trip you up, and the disappointment when you think we're all on the same page, so that this place has the same shared values, and then you go off a cliff and you're thinking, nah, that's not quite it. And it happens in other arenas, as I said, in the political world, in the other worlds that one inhabits. And then it requires what I call a little internal mental flexing, saying, maybe it's still okay. Maybe we can still make this thing work. Nobody's perfect, okay? So I think it's an interesting process. So come and ask me. I don't know how long this process is supposed to be before I feel I do totally belong, but I do feel I'm on the journey, and really grateful to the fantastic people. And Debesh, from the first conversation we had, in fact, he reached out to me. I didn't even have to go to him. That told me a lot about the place, that there are people who are prepared to pick up the phone and say hello and welcome. So thank you.
I'm going to ask you 2 questions. I'm going to ask you to be fairly brief in your response, because after that I'm going to ask you a final question. So the 2 questions are these. First of all, what is your biggest challenge in higher education? The one biggest challenge that you have. Okay, so what's your biggest challenge? And what are your thoughts on imposter phenomenon, sometimes called imposter syndrome? I stay away from syndrome because it's not a constellation of a disease. It is a phenomenon. It's something that it's experienced. It's a part of a lived and living experience. So what are your thoughts on that? So 2 questions: biggest challenge in leadership and your thoughts on imposter phenomenon.
I think probably my biggest challenge is managing competing imperatives to get things done. You can't get things done if you are just following the beat of your own drum. You only really get things done effectively if you are listening, taking in different perspectives and coming to the right way of doing things. And that for me is an ongoing challenge. It's also an ongoing, interesting process. In terms of imposter phenomenon, it's very difficult, I think, as a woman to divest oneself of that. I think it's an ongoing dialogue one has with oneself. It's culturally inherited. However conscious you are of it, it is always there, lurking on the sidelines, waiting to trip you up. And as Randa was saying, you know, if you feel like you're falling off a cliff, if you encounter obstacles, I think for many of us, it's not just a female thing, but I think it's particularly predominant in women. That question of, am I good enough? Have I got this right? Is never very far away. So I think we have to keep on talking about it. With colleagues, not just female colleagues. We have to keep on talking about it when we're looking at leadership training and leadership development, because it's very, very common. It's very common in academia as well, where people are prone to self-criticism and self-doubt. That process of contestation I was talking about earlier is very much turned inwards in academia as well. So that, I think, enhances one's likelihood of succumbing to imposter phenomenon.
Okay, so question 1, biggest challenge, loads of challenges. And I would say, and that includes me thinking about how can me, my school, us together thrive in this changing, challenging context. So that's what I'm thinking of. So how can we be the best in terms of providing students with fantastic learning opportunities? So that's what I keep at the top of my head. And on the imposter phenomenon, I started with when you posed it as in not me. And then I thought, okay, maybe I'm deluding myself. And then I tripped across to these little, you get these little flashes, a bit like little adverts that you see when you're walking around, flash, flash, flash. So I think, I feel people are disappointed, like that I'm not Indian enough for some of my Indian family, but I'm not British enough for some other groups, and I'm not quite there, and not perhaps woman enough for other groups because I don't do certain feminine things, perhaps. I don't know. There's some of the stereotypes. So it's or I'm not mother enough. Or not enough of a daughter. So though I think it's beyond the formal professional piece, I think I've kind of come through it and out the other end, thinking, so it doesn't quite connect, but recognizing there are places and spaces where the disappointment is evident, that you're not the perfect daughter, you're not the perfect mother, you're not the perfect Indian woman when you go to the Gurdwara and you have short hair. Even now, you go in, short hair, drinking alcohol. So we have to pretend it's Coke, and hide it under the table. Otherwise, like, oh, women don't drink alcohol, women don't eat meat. It's some of you think, God, look at you. Have you not got past it? But there are still places that I go to where as a woman, you eat meat, you drink alcohol, you wear skirts, show your legs, it still makes people uneasy. So I sort of try and climb past that and say, this is how I am and who I am, and maybe then this is not the place I spend too much time.
Thank you. So my final question is really about the future. So I'd like to know what you think the future holds for colleagues aspiring to be leaders, and if we kind of just focus in on International Women's Day, on female colleagues aspiring to be leaders in higher education, especially when it's so male-gendered at that level. In your opinion, is the sector ready, do you think, to embrace diverse forms of leadership? Or is it just a case of people getting a glimpse through the transparent ceiling, but not actually, and it's a glass ceiling, so you can see through, but you can't actually get through, you can't get into that space. And instead of getting into the space, you're given promises of getting into that space. So lots of shadow leadership, mentoring, and other kinds of coaching type opportunities, but you never really get there. So for younger colleagues coming into academia, I don't know if that's your destination, but for younger colleagues, for women, what does the future hold?
I know what I want it to hold, and that is a clear commitment to diverse leadership in HE with the structures that actually enable that. Now, mentoring, coaching, all of those things, they are incredibly important. They have to happen. But there has to be very clear pathways and a very clear commitment to actually realising diverse leadership. And unless that is translated into reality and monitored and checked against targets, sorry, this is slightly management speak, it won't happen. You'll get so far and no further. So it has to be planned, it has to be structured, and it has to be checked and reported. And I'm saying this partly as somebody who takes a lot of EDI reports through some of the work we're doing. We've got to keep an eye on this. We've got to very proactively make it happen. Support, mentoring, coaching is key, but it's not enough.
Thank you.
So I'm saying, why don't we be bold and pioneering and break the mold? Change the narrative, change the conversation, and be more challenging and stepping out. So Westminster, why not? Step up and step forward. So I think if we stay as we are, it's going to be a bit like little tiny raindrops when what we want is a tsunami. And I think the more we can get like-minded, brave people so all the support and training, I think it kind of really doesn't produce the outcomes, change we want fast enough. That'll be it. It'll be kind of not in our lifetimes. So how many women VCs are there? How many BAME VCs are there? How many BAME professors are there? And even here, it is interesting. I don't know. This is behind closed doors with a camera on. It's interesting, to have heard a conversation about fast-tracking a white male colleague into a professorship. And I think, ooh, lovely, that's wonderful. So would you do the same for a Deborah, perhaps, or someone else? And it's those kinds of things, saying, okay, so grab it if it's a precedent that is set to bring about the change. But I fear that we need a lot of courage and we need a lot of brave souls who will stand up and say, it is about time, okay? So it's almost like the contemporary version of the suffragette movement. We should all rise and speak up, because that's the other thing. Is we will say it, but, so that idea that you have a crescendo, so you have a voice where so many people are saying this, that it's unavoidable that it will not be heard. And I would love it if, as my new place of belonging 8 weeks in, Westminster could lead the way.
Thank you. Really powerful points. Questions? So we have a question from Sobia.
Hi. I just want to say I'm so happy to be here, to finally meet you all in person. It's been a long time coming, and so I'm really excited to be here. Sorry to be a little bit late. But Alex, I really related to some of what you said, which is interesting, because I thought, we think we would relate to those from similar backgrounds. But actually, when you said, I was ENTJ, I thought, oh, that was me 15 years ago before I started. I just started here and I had no leadership roles. And I think what came to me was, as women, we have leadership roles all of the time. And we can't just define them by the places we work in, because that would be really limiting. Because I haven't come across a woman yet who hasn't been in a leadership position in her home, in her voluntary work, with her neighborhood. I find all of those, leadership skills natural. Initially when I started, I've only dipped my toe into leadership, as it were, in the last few years. And actually, I've been rewarded with very kind people who have helped me on that journey. But I think the mistake sometimes women make is that they separate that as not being relevant. And maybe we need more integration of those skills. Certainly the skills that I built up doing a lot of my voluntary work, I naturally brought into some of my work here. And actually, I found it to be really interesting, because before I thought, okay, I'll keep it very separate. And I don't want to mix the two worlds, but actually aligning it takes a bold step. Because actually what you're doing is saying, this is what's important to me. And I have found, in terms of the EDI work, it's been really rewarding. It's not always been easy, but you don't expect that, because you've never had it easy elsewhere either. And that's when you learn through that journey what matters. And so it's been really interesting, because, in terms of the leadership and what we've seen here, I really want to engage more with how we can make a difference. Because with Westminster, I think we're in that unique position where we've got certain things right and other things that are really on the cusp. And it's an important time. And I think in terms of failure, because we think in terms of failure, imposter, phenomena, that what if it all goes wrong? What if you say something, or if you do something and you're just going to hit that wall? And I think one of the quotes, I don't know who said it, was, you cannot consider yourself to be a failure or unworthy without your consent. So part of it is about you and how you deal with that. And I think that's what I've seen, in terms of my own development as well. But I'm really glad to be surrounded by genuine people who want to make a difference, because I think that helps us to keep going. So, yeah. Thank you.
We have another.
Thank you. Firstly, just to say thank you very much to Alex and Randir, for the incredible generosity in sharing your personal reflections. And it would be wonderful to think going forward that sharing lived experience and autobiography is not just seen as kind of confessional, but also is seen as kind of legitimate sources of knowledge production. And so the more of these we can facilitate, the better. And I'm grateful to Deborah for her mention of Stuart Hall. And I would recommend, to colleagues and students, the work of Stuart Hall and his body of work, as the founding father of British cultural studies, which I think is significant. And I think cultural studies, I think here was born in the 60s. And at the time, I think the mantra that Stuart Hall put forward was that culture is ordinary. And I think he said that in order to highlight the fact that the academic space was at the time lofty, distant and detached from real life and the kind of messiness of real life. But also the fact that culture is ordinary and identity is situated, complex, contested, all the things that you were alluding to and talking directly about today. And of course, that discipline has a legacy which is profoundly positive for us. But today, I guess, picking up on some of the threads in the discussion, today we find ourselves with a really high level of awareness of what diversity means, how complex and layered it is, and how the way in which we are identitarianized, if you like, is so multidimensional that it can't be reduced and into formula. So we're in academic space. In terms of discourse and scholarship, our awareness is high and very deep, but we also have to contest with the way in which we are asked to categorize, let's say, students as male and female, or BAME, yeah, they're either black, Asian, white, or other. Now, we can go more fine-grained, but not through too many levels before you hit the floor. So I'm wondering, perhaps in terms of gender, how you think our intellectual and creative energy can be best spent to counter that, because there are clearly two conflicting obligations that we have. So any thoughts on how we tackle that? It's a paradox, you know. Thank you.
Can I just, so I'm going to take the easy bit of what you said and Sabia said, okay? And then I'm going to pass the meaningful stuff to Alex to come in with. So it's interesting you started by, talking about the idea of biography. And I think it's legitimate. So much of the literature on leadership talks about competencies and capabilities and style. It's very dated. I think where we are now, it's very much about the whole self, who we are, authentic leadership, genuineness, and all of those kinds of things that are now being spoken about in relation to leaderships. And I think part of that is about self, whole self, and disclosure. So I see it as a positive strength. So, and then as you were speaking, I thought, I wonder if we had a panel of men talking about personal identity, what they would talk about, and then how would we feel. And I have been places where people, they do, and then it's like, oh, how amazing, how empathetic, how sensitive, how connected. Oh, that's so amazing. I can see exactly why you're CEO. And I'm saying, we are doing it, and I see it as legitimate. I think it's powerful in terms of storytelling and sharing. So that was kind of my a little bit on that. And then it struck me, I too am an ENTJ. How shocking is that? Is it that we've all been crafted into the same profile without even realizing, a bit like taken over by aliens, and we are all the same profile? Now that is more worrying. But anyway, I'm going to leave my friend Alex to answer the real question.
Just before you do, Alex, I was just thinking that those points that you've raised, Samir, about these kind of two, they're not necessarily contested spaces. I actually see them as complementary spaces. One being kind of the core business of the university, so the gender, the race, the numbers, the data, all of that. The other side being what you called, I like the term, identitarianism. So this idea of, how one is about the experience, how we quantify that. The other is about the lived experience, how we qualify that. And I don't think that those two things need to exist in isolation. I think the sum of that, a bit like the Gestalt, the sum of that is the business of the university. We just have to find a way to make them complement each other. It's just my view.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I should say of the three NTJs in front of you, I think I'm going a bit more I these days, which has got to be a good thing, I suspect. your point about paradox is really interesting, Samir, and the fact that if universities are spaces of challenge and contestation, one of the things that they should challenge and contest are their own systems and practices, particularly some of those disciplinary and regulatory systems, and I'm using disciplinary in a particular sense, that categorise and create identity categories and discursify them and so forth. I think that the way we render those complementary is to enable our students, to enable our academic colleagues, our researchers, to develop the critical skills to see what those systems represent, not necessarily to resist them, but to understand the mechanism that, and the systems that operate within universities, and to enable that to become part of our thinking, not necessarily part of our resistance, but part of our thinking and part of our understanding. And I think that's so important to every aspect of the education we offer, including at undergraduate level. You know, we're in a very strange moment in higher education at the moment when we're getting lots of imperatives from things, for example, like the Office for Students, well, specifically the Office for Students. There is a rhetoric, an anti-expertise rhetoric at the moment, which is not helpful for HE. I think that if we do one thing across the disciplines we teach and research in, it's to develop that questioning, contestatory, challenging, intellectual set of skills, which is what higher education is about, and we would be forgiven for thinking these days it isn't about that, given some of the stuff that's coming our way from outside the academy.
Thank you. Useful? Yes. We have a final question. We have two more questions. Okay, we're going to take two more questions, and then I'm going to ask our Vice-Chancellor for a closing comment. Yeah. So,
yeah. Well, mine is in the question, really. It's when Deborah asked about sense of belonging. For, based on my experience, when I saw the PhD online, when I applied for it, I know what I wanted to get it. So I threw myself in it 100%. And it became very consuming because I wanted nothing but that at that point. But once I got rewarded, you have this sense of fear comes in you. And I was like, my God, what have I done? What have I actually done? I called my mom thinking she was going to help. She was like, when you go there the first day, dress nice. That's all. That's not helpful. Clothes not going to help. But yeah, she said, talk nice to everybody. You know, like the normal stuff your mother tells you. We came to the first day. I saw her, I saw him. I was like, okay, there's people that look like me. And then when we finished the first introduction, I remember going to Pete, or I don't know if he came to me, asked me, hey, who are you? And what are you doing? You know, what are you doing on subject? And I introduced to him what I'm doing. And I said, yeah, so everything sounds good about Westminster, but we will see if it's all true. So I don't know, something like that. He was like, why are you taking yourself out of the conversation? Well, we gave you a PhD, you accepted it, so you are we now, you are part of us. That, for me, I was like, a white man telling me that I'm part of what he's part of. That is something. You know, I felt welcome. Then the second time was Dibesh. The way he was excited about us three. He was showing us how to join a BME group and how to be part of it. I was like, whoa. He's brown, but he still isn't black, but he's so excited about us being here. That was the second thing. And the third thing was you, Deborah. Because I've basically stalked you, like I've been reading everything you do. And I remember my supervisors did Identity and Gender conference online in a Zoom meeting. I think you were there as well, I remember. I think it was Celia and Jennifer did the conference, yeah. And seeing you, not just seeing you having the hair that I have, was a lot. Because I remember thinking of cutting my dreadlocks because of the connotation it has. You know, I used to be a stylist back in the days, and I came to, so having a hair like that worked for me then. So coming to academia, the image that I had of it was, it's going to be very conservative, maybe having locks, people might think, you know. I thought about cutting my hair, then I saw your hair. I was like, if she's wearing it, I'm wearing it. And then not just that, is how stuff you were talking about in that conference. It's the first time I've seen, I've heard that. I remember it making me very emotional. I said, I am her accomplishment, because it's people that have been there before us. You know, that it's not because friend tells you, oh my God, you've done so well for yourself. I felt uncomfortable with that. Then hearing you speak, I was like, yeah, this is what it means to me. I am people like her accomplishments. So thank you for that day. It really made me feel part of this whole thing. And these two also, just having them, we clicked the first time and all that. So it was just, yeah, I don't know what a full sense of belonging means, but I feel comfortable being here. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Just have a quick point. I also started my PhD recently. I was awarded the Quinton Hodge studentship. But I had a point to make because you referenced Stuart Hall and also black feminism. And a lot of these thinkers and these people, they were pioneering when they did their work. They were doing a lot of what you said, contesting. So my question is, a lot of our stuff is very much against the grain. And it's like, how can you do this work still within a structure that promotes interdisciplinary work, but yet still has very set disciplines of way in which you do stuff? So what is the reality of actually doing some work that actually goes against the grain here? Yeah.
Can I just say very quickly, one of the reasons why this work works is because we are decolonizing the university. And so your work makes an important contribution to that change, to that revised and refreshed ethos. So consider your work valid in this space, in short.
So I wanted to just kind of add to what Randy was saying about kind of making space for yourself. Because I felt that. So we're coming into, so when I was in high school, for example, I had a teacher that told me, oh, you're not going to make it to college or make it to university. So I kind of put it on myself to kind of make space for myself and kind of put myself in the door and kind of just show that I'm actually going to make it and kind of show like my own like determination, to get here. Because, I come from like a rough neighborhood in like South London. So, most of my friends and stuff, they didn't like go to university or do masters or anything like that. So for me, it's like kind of making that point and like showing, especially for my younger brothers and sisters as well, that, we can put ourselves in these spaces and like make space. So yeah, thank you for your comments on that.
Thank you, Alex and Randir, for your stories and the input. My name is Anthony and I'm a visitor to your university. So I have two questions, and the first one, Randir, is to yourself. So you spoke about marrying outside of your... Yes. So in relation to that, what I would like to know is, how do your family and relatives think about your accomplishments and your roles that you have performed now, and how do they respond to you? And you can also answer that, Alex, if you wish. And are they more sympathetic and encouraging to young girls now wanting to pursue academia? The other question I had, wrote it down here, is come here.
So shall I start answering? Okay, that's fine. So why don't I answer that, and that'll give you a minute to... Okay. Again, gosh, we could talk for days, but we only have a minute. So the short answer, I would say, is no. Regrettably, in the little bit of family, because it's still very gendered. So it's still a very traditional sense of success. So it's, yes, okay, so you're in academia, fine, but you still kind of made choices because it's at an emotional level. So, career, success, it's almost like kind of external, but some of these other things that are so conflicted with hardcore internal, emotionally laden values, they still grip. And so it's still there. I don't think it'll ever go away. However, going forward, I think things have changed. So things are opening up for younger women. And so definitely I see change. Definitely I see greater levels of acceptance and openness. But certainly in terms of my little bit of the world, it's still very gendered. So had one of my brothers done what I've done, they were like, oh my God, he's magnificent. And it's like, oh, well, you, well, never mind. Yeah, and that's starting from a place when, again, disclosure, the day I was born, so people say, oh, never mind. Never mind. Instead of, oh, congratulations. It's never mind. It's a girl. Never mind. Next time. You know, so it starts from there, and then the stories continue. But it starts from a very early moment. And what's interesting is how much of that one internalizes over the years, because it comes from everywhere. And then ultimately how you get to say, well, okay, I know all that, but I'm still going to make choices that I want to make. And I think that's, for me, the remarkable thing in some ways. So I do think it is, in some ways, very remarkable that I'm here and in some of these other places. Don't quite know how it's happened, but it's kind of went against the grain entirely and against those astrological charts. My mum's going to ask for her money back.
And your second question?
Okay. Yes, Alex, you mentioned that you grew up in India, and then later on in life you found out that you have a very diverse family network, so to speak. So with that in mind, and I was going to ask you about leadership before when I wrote this down, well, your identity, but you've identified that you are a leader and that's your role and so on. If you were not a leader, so that was taken away, what else would you put all your energies into, and how would you like to encourage other younger women?
That's a really interesting question. In fact, I grew up in the UK, not very far from where I'm living now, actually, and that whole backstory about a mixed race background, an Anglo-Indian background, only became apparent in middle age. And one of the things I find myself thinking about in relation to that family history is what would have happened if it had taken place elsewhere, if it had remained in India, if it had taken place in India. It's a very fragmented family history. The people who were involved either didn't disclose things and they're dead anyway, but there are kind of snippets that suggest that for that family, my mother's line, there was a desire to be white, to cleave to whiteness, and in fact there was a maternal brother who was deemed too brown for the family photographs. And one of the things that I find myself reflecting on is if that skin tone had lasted 2 more generations, would I be in the position I'm in now or not? And it's a question I ask myself because of the kinds of things we've been talking about today. So I think I don't know what I would be doing if I hadn't had the career trajectory I'd had. I'm a deeply unimaginative person. I think I was kind of always pointing towards it, and I've beetled along my trajectory and done what was probably somewhat predestined by me rather than by a set of other external circumstances. But in terms of what I'm currently doing, because of that past, and because of a sense of inherited difference, my key commitment in the current moment of my career, and I've said this several times already, is to reflect on what we are doing as an institution, as the University of Westminster, to be actively and genuinely inclusive, to privilege equity rather than just equality, because when we talk about equity, we are recognising that people are not starting in the same place, that difference is a very real fact of life and has to be reckoned with when we're thinking about how we educate our students, how we design our curriculum, how we support colleagues in career progression and career development. So I think that there is a very, very, very instinctual link for me between that unknown, barely narrated family history, many, many thousands of miles away, and the work I'm doing now. So I think that's a kind of answer for your question, but not necessarily a full answer.
Thank you. I think it's a really good question for us all to think about, really. You know, if I weren't doing what I was doing now, what would I be doing? So with that said, Peter, can you offer us some comments?
I'll make some comments, but you know, with due humility to the evening and not having all the answers, but just some reflections. First is it's great privilege to listen to your stories. Randy, we're just getting to know each other. Alex, we've got to know each other well over the last period. And actually, I could say back some things, which I won't do, about how Alex has changed in terms of how she is as a leader during her period, particularly from the EDI side. I think it's been a really positive thing that's, I see the impact. And Deborah, you know, seeing you here and remembering you back then and seeing how you flourished. Of course, what I wished we'd had is you asking yourself the question so we could also hear your answers to those questions that you posed to the others. So, and also colleagues, you know, it's great to hear, like hearing your views as our new PhD cohort coming through, finding your confidence and your voice. Sabia, you know, you lead our Women of Westminster, which is a real powerhouse of view, opinion, empowerment, and others. It's great to be here. But I think that the sort of things this is a forever journey that we just got to keep fighting for. You know, we've got to really keep pushing and taking positive action to make our place the place we'd like it to be. And picking up your point, you know, when we met, and it's not what the university does to you, it's how we as a community make this type of place we want it to be. And I think we should, you know, we have to keep going. Wherever we are in a year, we need to do better. Wherever we are in 2 years, we need to do better. But we should draw some confidence from some of the changes that have happened to progress forward. So how many people now in our WOW network, for example? 233. Our BME network is flourishing. Our new networks on disabilities is going to be really powerful, and faith and spirituality. So people have voices. Look at election to academic council and court. We're now getting people who have the confidence and feel empowered to get to the very top level of leadership to make views. On promotions, I was just adding up on professors and readers. So I know professors and readers for the last 3 years, and I know professors for the year before. 40 promotions, all bar 5 are women, and of those 3 look white. But of course, you can't assume where that whiteness comes from. So the point is there is some, and that's not just achieved randomly, that's achieved through positive action that's given people confidence. So I think, but there's so much more to do. So the point is, it's great to have this, and we've had loads of these. Your Black History Year events with you, Grace, and others are really important and empowering things. So I think we just got to keep working on. And what I'm pleased is the cynicism and the skepticism about these matters, which is absolutely well-founded and needed, really seems to be diminishing. It's you know your boulder analogy, Randir. You see a boulder, and the point is there's massive boulders in the way of lots of the things we want to be here. But the point is, if we can attack the boulder, like you said, and find a way around it, and we can reduce the cynicism and skepticism, it gets in the way of taking action, and that's positive. The other thing I think we need to do as a community is we've got to drop that academic acceptance of destructive critical. Being critical is good, being destructive critical is bad. being constructive critical is good. And some of the worst destructive criticism I see is like somebody saying something, you get a raised eyebrow. Or, you know, somebody who's building confidence, which is trashed and diminished by a small comment or a phrase or a Twitter response or something. And I think one of the things we need to spearhead here at Westminster now is, of course, critical thinking is necessary, and we do it in a constructively critical way where I'm doing work with our PhDs, and also I'm doing a review for one of the research councils at the moment. I keep meeting PhDs, and they just say, if only they asked me how I was, or before they went into the brutal, destructive critique of my work, they made some positive comments about things I'm actually doing quite well at. I think we need to, so hearing some of those comments, you know, about, I think we could do a lot to improve that culture. But otherwise, as I say, fantastic to be together, and it's just another little step on our journey to make our place the place we want it to be. So thanks hugely for a great evening. Thank you, Grace, as well, for putting it on. Thank you.
So hold the applause just a second, because you're going to do this again with full force. So I just want to conclude by just thanking everyone. I mean, what tonight has said to me is that cultural narratives of experience are important, but what's more important is that they are heard. And one of the things I think that we really want to get to as a university is to be a listening space and a safe space for these kinds of conversations to be had. And the learning that comes out of that is profound. So even in terms of some of the questions that you've asked and you shared your own experiences, really powerful exchange of stories, and the idea of cultural crossings as well, you know, how we navigate those on so many levels is really key to this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing, thank you for listening. I want to thank some people in particular. So I'd like to thank Grace. Grace, please stand. So Grace has been our events coordinator, just organising everything for us. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Divesh for being the mic person this evening. Thank you. Special thanks to our AV support at the back, recording everything for us. Thank you very much. I don't know everyone's names, but I'd like to thank our PhD students for coming out. You're so appreciated. Your work is appreciated. Thank you. Our Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Education. Thank you so much, Sal. I'd like to thank you as well. I don't know your names. I'm going to find out afterwards. Thank you so much for coming. A colleague at the back there as well. Thank you, Samir. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. I want to just remind you that tomorrow in this space at 6 o'clock, we continue our Westminster Conversation series with a talk given to us by Professor Gurnam Singh. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Professor Gurnam Singh, and he will discuss what it takes to become an anti-racist university. Really key topical issue of the times, with a talk entitled Building an Anti-Racist University. Easier said than done, but not impossible. I hope you can join us for that talk. Thank you again.
Thank you. Let's have a really big round of applause for our chair, please.